Hey everyone, Tactics here with more Season 2 guide content, where in this video we'll be going over the Rookery, discussing the most important trash and boss abilities as well as how I recommend you handle them. If you're looking for the entire breakdown of every single ability by dungeon for this season, you should definitely check out my Mythic Plus spreadsheet, which I talk about in a video that I'll link down in the description below. Plus, I've got a ton of other guide content coming for Season 2 over the next few weeks, so make sure you are subscribed to the channel. Otherwise, let's start with the mini boss that you'll need to defeat in order to get to the first boss's room, Quartermaster Koratite. This guy's got a couple different abilities. The first is Bounding Void, which is a random target frontal attack which shoots out 3 orbs in a cone, and then those orbs slowly come back to the mob after a delay. So you really want to make sure you move away from this ability and you don't move back until those orbs have returned. The other ability is Entropy Shield, where the mini boss faces a random direction and throws up a barrier. This will block and deflect all abilities coming from that direction, so you really want to make sure you rotate around the mob when that happens. From here, you'll be able to jump on some griffins and ride into the first boss's room, where there's some new mobs that you'll face. There are spam casters in this room in Cursed Thunderers, so you want to use all your spare kicks on their random target lightning bolt ability. Outside of that, there's only one other interrupt in this area, and that's from the Cursed Rook Tenders and their Lightning Surge ability. This cast will enrage one of the nearby Storm Rooks, drastically increasing their damage and attack speed, so interrupting this is definitely preferred, but if you have a Soothe, you can also use that to remove the buff. Speaking of the Storm Rooks, there's a couple of them in this area. The first is the Unruly Storm Rook, and these guys have a random target ability in Energized Barrage. This is a channel, so you'll want to use a CC to stop the cast while it's in channel to prevent it from doing too much damage. The other Griffin in this area are the Lieutenant Mob's Void Riders, and they have a couple of abilities. The first is Wild Lightning, which shoots out line attacks towards 3 random players, which you want to make sure you avoid. And the other is Localized Storm, which is channels for heavier group damage for 5 seconds. So healers, be prepared for this. And anyone, if you're targeted by other abilities while this is happening, you want to make sure you press a defensive. After clearing out this room, you can take on Kyrioss, which rotates between fighting the boss on the platform and then it flying up for an intermission phase. Starting with the boss phase, you'll generally want to be loosely spread here to avoid cleaving each other when the Crashing Thunder ability goes out, which is an 8-yard AoE hit around every single player. This actually hits quite hard as key levels increase, so you'll eventually need to make sure that you always have some small defensive running for these hits. The boss also does Wild Lightning in this phase, similar to the Trash Mob that we just mentioned. However, this one targets all 5 players instead of just 3, so it can be easier to avoid this if your melee is grouped up, clustering all those lines in one area, and just have a lot more safe space to work with. Just make sure you don't get cleaved by that Crashed Thunder AoE. At 100 energy, the intermission begins with the boss jumping to the center of the room and using Lightning Torrent, which causes ticking group damage for 15 seconds and injects 4 beams which rotate in a random direction around the room. These beams always start on the grates near the center of the room, so I recommend having your party group up between 2 sets of grates as this phase is beginning, which allows you to adapt to the movement of the beams depending on which direction they choose. On top of these beams, the boss intermittently creates grounding bolt circles under all players, so again, it can be useful for space to have your melee be stacked in this phase and just have all their circles spawn in one area and then they just move onwards in the direction that you are traveling in. After this channel completes, takes 15 seconds, the boss will then target a random player with Lightning Dash, which is a 12-yard AoE, so you just want to get out of that, and then from there, the fight just repeats. After defeating the boss, you'll be able to jump down the shaft in the middle of the room, pick up these feathers, which give you an extra action button that lets you kind of heroic leap your way safely to the bottom, and there's a bunch of new trash here to greet you. The main lieutenant mob in the area are the Coalescing Void Diffusers, and these guys are pretty dangerous. They have the Attracting Shadows AoE ability, which drops a 7-yard circle on the ground, which then pulls all players in and also deals pretty heavy ticking damage over 6 seconds before finally exploding and killing anyone in the 7-yard AoE. So when this goes out, you want to make sure healers, you have some healing prepped. You want to make sure everyone is running away from this void zone so they don't get destroyed by the final hit. And if there's any other damage going out at the same time, you want to make sure Players targeted by those damage events use a defensive. Speaking of what could be going out, one ability is their other cast in Arcing Void. This targets a random player and creates a very large circle around them, showing anyone it will cleave to, so you want to make sure you spread out away from your friends when this happens. Other mobs in this area are the Void Cursed Crusher. These guys have a passive that tanks want to be aware of in Void Claw, which causes their melee attacks to stack up a healing reduction on you, which only lasts for 3 seconds. So you want to watch your stacks here, and if you need to, use things like AoE stuns, knockback, slows to get away from the pack for long enough that you can reset your stacks. Their other ability is Void Crush, which causes them to leap to a random player and do a 4-yard AoE around them. Kind of similar strategy with the Arcing Void here. Just make sure your group is a bit spread to avoid this from cleaving. The caster in this area are the Corrupted Oracles. They have a spam cast and Void Bolt, which you want to keep interrupted. And other than that, they will occasionally throw out the Seeping Corruption Curse dot on a random player. So if you have a curse to dispel it as fast as you can. If you don't, that player will definitely want to press a defensive and watch these circles that they'll constantly be dropping under their feet. From there, we can talk about Stormguard Gorren, where the most important thing here is managing your space, as the boss creates a lot of area denial through his Crush Reality ability. This causes the boss to jump towards a random ranged player, leaving behind a large puddle for 2 minutes, causing beams to shoot out from that area that you need to avoid, and also dealing a hit of shadow damage to your group. Because this always targets a ranged player, I recommend any range in your group play towards the edge of the room next to existing puddles if possible, in order to just maximize your space. For some additional damage, the boss will debuff a random player with Chaotic Corruption. This is a 5-second dot that starts with 4 stacks. It explodes in an AoE around the player on expiration, and then jumps to the nearest player with 1 less stack, which means 4 total sets of this dot per cast. The original player also gets a Chaotic Vulnerability debuff, meaning non-tank players want to avoid being targeted by this dot twice during its duration. I recommend bouncing to your tank first, then to any player that wasn't the initial target, then back to your tank. Tanks, be aware here, you may need to use a defensive on the second dot application since you will have a vulnerability on you, but there isn't a lot of tank damage otherwise, so this usually is fine to do. But if you do prefer to not do this, you can just send that last application of the dot to another player that hasn't had it yet. Non-tank players may also want to use a defensive ability, specifically if you have this dot at the same time as another Crush Reality cast goes out, as that's the largest damage intake of the entire fight. Finally, this boss will occasionally channel Dark Gravity, dealing ticking shadow damage to the group and pulling players towards him before exploding for lethal damage to anyone within 10 yards, kind of like that trash ability we discussed earlier. So make sure you have healing prepped and everyone is moving away from the boss during this cast. From here, you can make your way even further down, and on your way, there's only 2 new mobs to be aware of. The first is the Void Ascendant mob, which is a lieutenant who has a similar spam cast and Void Bolt as we saw earlier, so keep kicks on that. Other than that, he'll use Feasting Void to apply a magic dot and healing absorb to all players. You can remove this with something like Massive Spell, and it also is removed if you just heal off the absorb it applies. Finally, there's Umbral Wave, which shoots out a couple sets of orbs away from this mob, which you want to make sure you're avoiding. The other mob down below are the Consuming Voidstones. Melee want to watch out for where the tank is while fighting this mob, as it has a passive and volatile void, which causes its melee attacks to do a 3-yard AoE shadow hit around the tank, so make sure you are away from them. Other than that, you want to be careful about pulling other mobs with these lieutenants, because they have the Void Extraction ability, which causes them to gain a stacking 2% damage increase for any player or mob within 40 yards. So if you pull a lot of the citizen mobs in this area and the mob casts Void Extraction, you're in for a tough time, so beware of when this cast goes out. The other major ability this mob has is Unleash Darkness. This is an extremely long channeled ability which deals ticking damage every 4 seconds and also spawns a bunch of circles on the ground which you need to avoid. So you just want to make sure you have healing prepared for when this ability begins. Upon engaging the final boss, you'll notice it has a large shield in Void Shell, which accounts for 20% of the boss's max HP. While this shield holds, you'll be dealing with various boss mechanics, starting with Unleash Corruption, which is a magic dot that goes out on 2 random players and leaves behind a puddle on removal. So you want to make sure you are dispelling this as quick as you can to minimize the dot damage, but you also don't want to dispel this too quickly while players are out of position, as that can cause you to run out of usable space around the boss, especially in melee, very quickly. Outside of this, you want to be aware of the Null Upheaval cast, which happens when the boss reaches full energy. This ability deals a hit of shadow damage to the party, knocks everyone back, and spawns several swirlies which you'll need to avoid. At the same time, it spawns 3 Voidstone fragments around the room, which if not destroyed within 15 seconds will form into adds that pulse for heavy group damage due to corruption overload. To destroy them, all non-tank players get marked with Storm Rider's Charge, giving them a 12-second speed boost, which then destroys any fragments within 10 yards on expiration. To deal with this, I recommend having one DPS player assigned to each of the 3 platforms that surround the boss, and then you have your healer kind of float in the middle platform, ready to shift if needed. For tanks, make sure you never leave melee, as otherwise this stationary boss will spam cast Entropy, likely resulting in a wipe. Otherwise, you just want to make sure that you play away from the rest of your party here, and then use a defensive on every cast of Oblivion Wave, as this deals heavy damage to all players in quite a wide line targeted at the tank, and you do not want to hit any of your party with it. It is possible to avoid the damage of the wave entirely if you play on the edge of the boss's hitbox and use a movement ability right after it finishes casting, but this is a bit riskier and not necessary at all for most key levels, so I don't recommend doing this. Now, once you actually deplete the Void Shell shield on the boss, you'll enter the Storm's Vengeance burn phase, which stuns the boss and causes it to take 100% increased damage for 20 seconds. The more damage you do here, the shorter your boss fight is going to be, so you want to make sure that you line up your cooldowns for this push, and also if you have it, things like Bloodlust are great to help you get in as much damage as possible. Once the stun ends, the boss will re-shield himself, and the fight just repeats from there. But there we have it, guys. That is my guide to the Rookery in the War Within Season 2. Hopefully you learned something here, and if you did, make sure to leave a like and subscribe for more content like this, including dungeon guides for every single Season 2 key, Keystone Legend route walkthroughs with commentary to help you get your new achievement and mount, Liberation of Undermine raid boss guides, and of course, much more. As always, I would not be able to do this without all the support from my amazing Patreon, so thank you guys so much, and I'll see everyone in the next video.